The boy had a bloody nose before the war even started. He was 11 years old on the day they came, and he was hiding in the back of a supply closet at Meridian Station's lower ring, pressing a wad of recycled cloth against his face while two older kids pounded on the door and laughed. He didn't cry. He'd stopped doing that 6 months ago, when he figured out it only made the pounding last longer. He sat in the dark with his knees pulled up and waited. His name was Matti Silenzi. Everyone called him Matti. He was thin and quiet, and not particularly good at anything that anyone had decided mattered, which, on a station of 1,200 colonists, meant not good at the hydro shifts, not good at atmospheric calibration, not good at the organized sport they played in the observation deck where everyone was supposed to bond. He was good at noticing things nobody else noticed. He was good at slipping away. He'd never thought of those as powers. Pounding stopped. He heard the two boys walk away, their boots ringing on the grating, their voices fading down the corridor. He counted to 60 before he cracked the door. He came out into the corridor, with the cloth still pressed against his nose, and nearly walked into his mother. She looked at him. She was in her patrol jacket, the gray one with the station crest on the shoulder, her dark hair pulled back tight, her face doing the thing it always did when she was trying not to look worried. The careful stillness, the eyes that moved a little too fast. "Your nose," she said, tripped. She looked at him for a long moment. She had the kind of face that could hold a lot of weather behind it without letting any of it break through. But something moved in her expression then. Not pity, which he couldn't have stood, but something more complicated. She handed him a clean cloth from her jacket pocket. "I need you back in the quarters by 1800, she said. "We're having a briefing." "What kind of briefing?" "The kind you'll hear about at 1800. She paused. "You all right?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm good." He wasn't good. He had 34 credits left in his personal account, and he'd been saving them for a replica costume at the fabrication stall in the market ring, the one modeled on the Castellan. Some hero from an old Earth series he'd watched too many times on the archive terminal. It was stupid, and he knew it was stupid. But the carnival rotation came to Meridian every 8 months, and this time the stall would have it, and he'd wanted it. Now Jaden Brasco had his 34 credits, and was buying something he'd spend in a day, and Matti was standing in a corridor with a bloody nose, and none of it mattered. He bought the costume anyway. It was a different stall, the kind that sold secondhand things people had traded or abandoned, and instead of the Castellan, they had something he'd never heard of. A figure from some regional archive, some hero from a culture he couldn't name, wearing a black outfit with silver stitching that meant nothing to him but was still undeniably cool. Cost 28 credits. He bought it. He wore it to the Ring Market Festival that evening because there was nothing else to do, and because his mother had forgotten to be home by 1800, which happened sometimes when she was on a case. He stood at the edge of the market ring in his ridiculous costume, while kids he sort of knew ignored him, and kids he didn't know at all ignored him slightly more, and he watched a girl named Stella Vare do something extraordinary. She was doing gymnastics in the central space, where people sometimes cleared a lane for performances. Not for an audience. Really. She'd started doing it and people had simply stopped and watched the way you do when someone is doing something that commands watching. She moved like physics was a suggestion. She moved like her body had thought carefully about the problem of being a body, and arrived at conclusions the rest of them hadn't reached. Matti stood at the edge of the cleared space and forgot for a while that he existed. Then Jaden Brasco showed up with 3 of his friends, and found Matti standing there, and that was the end of that. The public embarrassment was thorough and efficient, the way Jaden's humiliations always were. He had a gift for it. He found the thing that would land worst and delivered it in front of the largest audience. And the worst thing in this case was that Matti had been watching Stella, and everyone now knew it, and Stella herself was standing 15 meters away when it happened. Matti ran. He found a storage bay in the lower ring that had a broken seal on the door, which meant nobody used it. which meant it was his. He sat on a crate in the dark and pressed his back against the wall and breathed through his nose and told himself he didn't care. He fell asleep there. When he woke up, the station was different. He didn't know it yet. He was groggy and his neck hurt from the crate, and he was still wearing the costume. And when he looked down at his hands in the low emergency lighting, he couldn't see them. He thought his eyes weren't working. He moved a hand in front of his face. Nothing. He spent 4 minutes thinking he'd gone blind before he reached out and felt his fingers close around a pipe fitting, solid and real, and realized, he could see the pipe fitting. He could not see his hand. He sat very still for a long time in the empty storage bay, with his invisible hands in his lap and his heart going very fast. The Vo'keth had been watching Meridian Station for 11 months before they moved. That was how they worked, Matti would learn later. They were patient in a way that made human patience look like fidgeting. Patient in a ways that felt geological. The way mountains are patient, the way they don't particularly notice the river that will eventually reduce them to a delta. They identified the station, cataloged its defenses, confirmed it held what they were looking for. And then they came in 3 ships that registered as freight haulers, until they were close enough that registering differently didn't matter. What they were looking for was children. Not because they were cruel, or at least not for that reason specifically. The Vo'keth had a different problem. Their gene tech had hit a wall 200 years ago. A wall their biologists had stopped being able to see clearly because they'd all been raised inside the assumptions that created it. They needed fresh code. They needed biological diversity. They needed what they called, in the sharp syllabic shorthand of their language, the unrestricted iteration, which translated loosely as genetic material in its developmental phase, not yet settled, still in the process of becoming children. They took them carefully. They did not like noise. They selected for specific traits, aptitudes, markers they could read from bioscan at range, and they came quietly into stations and colony ships and took what they'd selected and left. And they left behind the kind of nothing that was worse than wreckage. The kind that looked almost normal until someone's child didn't come home. On Meridian, they had identified 6. Matti was one of them. He didn't know that yet either. He spent 2 days learning what he could do, which was turn invisible. That was it. It was not, in fairness, a small thing, but it was simpler and stranger than he'd expected a power to be. He had to be completely undressed for it to work consistently. Something about the costume's fabric interfering with whatever was happening to his skin, which created logistical problems he spent a lot of time thinking through. He could go visible again if he concentrated. He could hold the invisible state for about 4 hours. Before he got a headache that made the whole world tilt. He used it the first day to get his 34 credits back. He did not hurt Jaden. He'd had fantasies about that. Grandiose ones. Elaborate. But standing invisible in the boys' quarters while Jaden snored and the credits sat on his console, Matti found that the fantasy didn't survive contact with the actual Jaden Brasco, who was just a sleeping kid who smelled like recycled air soap. Matti took the credits and also took a candy bar. Jaden would never notice was missing and left. He sat on the swing set in the observation park. A small deck fitted with old Earth playground equipment somebody had thought was a good idea, which it sort of was. And he ate the candy bar while the stars moved past the viewport, and felt very cautiously, like himself. The swing next to him moved. He looked over and saw Stella Vare sitting down in it, facing the viewport. She hadn't seen him. There was nothing to see. She just sat there for a while, watching the stars, her legs pumping absently. "Hey," she said, without looking over. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure how she knew. "The swing was moving," she said. "I'm not stupid." He held still. "Not going to say anything," she said. "Whatever this is, I'm not going to say anything." She paused. "Are you the one who freaked out Ivan Brask in the corridor this morning?" Because his face was fantastic. He almost laughed. He caught it and turned it into a sound that was mostly just air. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." She started pumping the swing proper, rising and falling. "You should be careful," she said. are people on this station asking questions. My mom's been. She stopped just. Be careful. He was careful. Was not careful enough. The first one taken was a boy named Martino from C Ring, 12 years old, extraordinary with numbers. He could look at a structural stress calculation and find the error faster than the engineering AI, which the engineers found alternately impressive and annoying. He went missing on a Tuesday, and for 3 days nobody was certain he was actually missing. Because Martino was the kind of kid who could disappear into a technical manual for a weekend and not surface. Then a girl from the gymnasium. She was a prodigy in her own right. Something in her muscle memory that the trainers said was categorically different from normal human aptitude. From C-Ring, who was, from what Matti understood, still mostly a bully, but a bully with an unsettling gift for navigation, for knowing where things were without being told. 3 children in 10 days. The station was not calm after that. Matti's mother was working double shifts. She came home with the look she had, when cases were going badly, the tight face, the silences, that meant things she wasn't saying. She sat across from him at dinner and asked how his day was, and he said fine. And she said good, and they ate in a quiet that had weight to it. He wanted to tell her. He had wanted to tell her since the first morning. He was her son and he was invisible, and children were going missing from the station, and there was something building in him that felt like the pressure before a seal blew. Contained, unbearable, only a matter of time. He didn't tell her, because he didn't know how to explain the part that came before the power. He didn't know how to explain the storage bay, and the costume, and Jaden Brasco's 34 credits, and Stella Vera on the swing, the whole crooked landscape of being Matti Silenzi, because it would require her to see it clearly, and he was afraid of what she'd see. On the 11th day, he met a blind man in the lower ring. The man was sitting at the edge of the maintenance corridor that ran beneath the water recycling units, doing nothing, wearing a coat that was slightly wrong for the station's temperature. And when Matti walked past, he said, without turning, "You should stop walking with your feet so heavy. They'll track you by the vibration." Matti stopped. He was visible. He hadn't activated anything. "Sit down," the man said. "I've been waiting for you." His name was Androvich. He was not, as it turned out, blind. His eyes were just damaged in a way that made them look that way, pale and fixed, though they tracked Matti with a precision that felt like something other than sight. He said he was Matti's father. Matti's first response was disbelief, then anger, then a kind of cold quiet that he'd learned to use when his feelings were moving too fast to manage. He sat on a pipe housing across from the man and listened. The story was not simple. The simplified version was this. Androvich and a woman Matti had never met had been part of an earlier generation of what he was. Not the first. There had been others in other places, for longer than anyone had tracked. A gene pattern that appeared spontaneously. No hereditary logic that the geneticists could find, expressing differently in every carrier. Androvich's version was spatial perception, so precise he could feel the topology of a room through air currents. His mother's version, his birth mother, the woman he hadn't met, was something Androvich described carefully, choosing his words. She moves through things, he said, not invisibility. More fundamental. She can be between the states of matter when she chooses. He paused. Felt the power in the costume, yes? It's not the costume. No. The fabric resonates with what your skin does. It amplifies. The power is yours. He was quiet for a moment. She's alive. I need you to know that. She's looking for you. Matti said nothing. The Vo'keth have been looking for children with your kind of variation for a generation, Androvich said. They believe it's the key to something in their biotech. They're wrong. As it happens, the power isn't extractable that way. It can't be grafted or sequenced into their systems. The whole project is based on a misunderstanding of what the gene is doing. They don't know that, and they've taken a lot of children before someone figured it out. And by then, how many? Enough, the man said quietly. They sat in the maintenance corridor for 2 hours. Androvich gave him the black outfit. Not a costume, exactly, more Sausican skin, developed specifically for his ability. The fabric designed to turn with him, to remain invisible when he was, to not float around like a ghost wardrobe giving him away. He showed Matti how to control the shift, faster, how to hold it longer, how to come back in without the headache. He talked about breath, about intention, about the strange fact that the body knows more than the mind, and the mind's job is mostly to get out of the way. The one they want most, Androvich said near the end, is the gymnast, the Vare girl. Her variation is kinetic, entirely different expression from yours, but the markers present similarly. They'll come for her soon. Matti was already standing up. He found her in the gymnasium at 0300, drilling on the beam. She was the only one there, the lights set to the working level she preferred. Half bright, a little blue, designed for focus rather than performance. He stood at the edge of the space and watched her for a moment, and then said, from nowhere visible, Stella. To her credit, she didn't fall. She landed a dismount, turned around, scanned the room. Invisible boy, she said. They're coming for you tonight, he said. I think. I'm not sure about the timing, but soon. Someone told me. He paused. My father. It's complicated. She looked in the direction of his voice. Expression was not quite what he'd expected. Not fear, exactly. Something more like the face she'd made on the swing. Steady, and tilted forward, like she was leaning into information, rather than away from it. Okay, she said. What do we do? He hadn't planned this part. He'd had some idea of warning her, getting her to his mother, something procedural. He hadn't planned on her saying, okay, and asking what they were going to do. I think, he said carefully, I need to be here when they come, and me, you should. I'm not leaving, she said. This is my gym. If someone's coming here for me, I want to see it. You won't see them. They're good at. Then stand near me, she said, so they can't get to me without getting to you first. He crossed the gymnasium in the dark and stood 2 feet to her left. She turned back to the beam and began the routine again from the beginning, fluid and precise, and he stood in the shadows and watched the door. They came at 0340. There were 3 of them. That was the first surprise. Matti had somehow imagined an army, a fleet, something proportional to the size of what they'd done. 3. In the close black suits the Vo'keth used for close contact operations, with the rebreathers that made their already failing faces into something architectural, impersonal, arranged. They moved like people who had done this many times, silently, efficiently, with the particular grace of something that has never expected resistance. One of them was carrying a sedation rig. Matti had been briefed on those by Androvich, a molecular dispersal system, effective at 6 meters, designed to be quiet and kind in the way that things are sometimes kind, because kindness is more efficient than the alternative. Challenge. They fanned out. They had equipment that read heat signatures, and Stella was the only heat source in the gymnasium, and she was right where they'd expected her to be, finishing a routine, hands raised. Her whole body still for a moment, in that held pose at the end that gymnasts do, balanced on everything they've learned. He moved. He had one advantage. He had always had it, all his life, this one miserable advantage. He knew how to be invisible. Not the power, not the biology. The ordinary invisibility of being the kid nobody looked at. Being in the room while everyone's attention ran past him. Being exactly the wrong size to register. He had spent 11 years learning how to exist in plain sight without being seen, and now he used it. He went for the one with the sedation rig first. He hit the rig rather than the person. Androvich had told him, don't try to fight Vo'keth hand to hand. They're physically superior in every relevant metric. Their reflexes were modified for this work. Specifically, you will lose and you will lose fast. Hit the equipment, they are what they carry. The rig went down and discharged against the floor, and the gymnasium filled with a fog that made everything shimmer at the edges. And one of the Vo'keth went down hard because it had been closest when the dispersal hit. Matti was already moving. The second one found him by vibration. Exactly as Androvich had warned, and caught his arm. And for about 4 seconds, Matti understood comprehensively what it meant to be held by something that was not entirely like him. The grip was absolute. It wasn't brutal, wasn't aggressive, was simply mechanical, in a way that had nothing to do with wanting to hurt him. It was the grip of something that had classified him as an object to be transported, and was executing that classification. He stopped fighting. That was the thing. That was the specifically human trick that Androvich had not told him about, because maybe Androvich didn't know it either. Because it required being the particular kind of person who had spent 11 years being invisible in the ordinary sense, being the kid nobody feared, being the kid who went limp rather than fight, because fighting only made the pounding last longer. He went completely still. The Vo'keth recalculated. That was what they did when inputs stopped matching predictions. They paused and recalculated. Because they were methodical, because they had learned that humans responded to force, with stillness. Because they had done this enough times to have expectations. Stella hit it with a gymnastics beam. She had pulled the portable one down off the rack. Light carbon fiber, designed for practice, not a weapon. Except that anything is a weapon if you're strong enough, and precise enough, and you've spent enough of your life calculating exactly where your body is in space, relative to every other object in the room. She hit it twice, which was enough, and then grabbed Matti's free arm and they ran. They ran through maintenance corridors he knew by heart. He'd been running from people in these corridors for years, and she matched his pace without asking where they were going. And when he pushed through a sealed door into a section of the station she clearly hadn't been in before, she just ran. The third Vo'keth did not follow immediately. That was the second surprise. They were. Matti would think about this later, much later, when he had the distance to think about it clearly, recalibrating. They had encountered something their models hadn't predicted. A human child who went still when grabbed. A human child who had a collaborator. A human child who knew the station's maintenance grid well enough to move through it at speed in the dark. Not the models. The station's security system found the Vo'keth because Matti's mother had been running a silent sweep since the second abduction, and she had finally figured out what to look for. Not the ships, which were disguised, but the rebreather chemical signature, a specific gas blend that Vo'keth physiology required, and that didn't exist anywhere in the station's atmospheric mix. She triangulated it to the gymnasium at 0342, and was in the corridor 30 seconds later, with 2 security officers and an alert going to the station council. And what she found when she got to the gymnasium was one Vo'keth sedated on the floor from its own rig, one with a cracked rebreather housing bleeding the gas that was its oxygen equivalent, and one that was gone. The one that was gone was the one that was following Matti. He met it at the junction of Maintenance Corridor 7 and the water recycling access shaft. In the dark, alone, Stella had split from him 2 corridors back. There'd been no plan for it. She'd seen a door half open to a section he hadn't known, and made a call and gone through it. He'd heard the door cycle shut behind her. And then he was alone, and the Vo'keth was 20 meters back and closing. He stopped running. He turned around. He stood in the dark in his second skin suit, and he did the thing that was hardest. Not the courage part, not the standing and facing a thing that could kill you part. Those were the easy parts because they happened fast and didn't require choosing. The hardest part was the part before. The part where you stopped being afraid of being seen. He turned visible. He stood in the maintenance corridor. Visible. A kid in a dark suit with his heart in his throat. And he looked at the thing that had been hunting him. It stopped. 3 seconds it was absolutely still. And in those 3 seconds he saw what Androvich had been talking about. The recalibration. The moment where the model met the reality and didn't recognize it. It had come to this station for invisible children. For children who slipped away, who hid, who couldn't be found. It had never, in its careful operational history, had one of them stand in a corridor and look back. He said, in the quiet flat voice he'd learned to use when he was scared. "You've got the wrong idea about us." It moved toward him. "The gene doesn't work the way you think," he said. "Whatever you're trying to do, it won't work. The whole thing won't work. My father knows." It reached for him. The lights came on. Not slowly. All of them. All at once. every light in the maintenance corridor blazing, and every alarm in Section 7 going off simultaneously in a frequency that the Vo'keth rebreather system could not filter, that its biology had not been designed to withstand in closed-in spaces. And the thing stumbled. The Vo'keth operational manual, which Matti did not have but which existed, had a detailed section on the sensitivity of the species' auditory processing to synthetic alarm systems in enclosed spaces at close range. It was detailed because it had happened before. It was in the manual because some human, somewhere on some station, had figured it out. Psst. The alarm was still going when his mother came through the door. She came through it fast, with the two officers behind her, and she had her sidearm out, and she stopped 3 meters away and assessed the scene. Her son visible in the corridor, the Vo'keth disoriented and reaching for the wall. She moved past Matti, put herself between him and the alien, and stood. Not advancing, not retreating, just standing. He'd watched her do that his whole life. Stand in the space between a situation and whoever she was protecting. The stillness that was different from the Vo'keth stillness. Warm where theirs was calculated. Present where theirs was procedural. He understood, standing behind her in the corridor, that she'd always been doing the same thing he'd been doing. Different version of the same impossible job. Hold still. Let them see you. Don't let them have the thing they came for. The Vo'keth settled. The alarm was still howling. One of the officers moved to flank. "It's over," his mother said to the alien, in a voice that had no uncertainty in it at all. "The other two are contained. Your ships are being tracked. Whatever you came here for," she paused, "you're not leaving with it." The aftermath lasted weeks. 3. Vo'keth in custody was a diplomatic situation that the station council was not equipped to handle. So, people came from the colony administration, and then from the transit authority, and then, eventually from a body whose actual name Matti never heard clearly, but which seemed to be something like an early framework for exactly this kind of contact. People in different colored uniforms filled the station's conference spaces and talked in low, urgent voices about protocols and precedents. And the children who had already been taken. Martino came home. He came home 36 days after he'd been taken, when the transport that had been intercepted by the transit authority was processed and the cargo manifests examined. He was thin, and he had the careful way of moving that belongs to people who have been somewhere they couldn't leave, but he was intact. And he sat in the medical bay and looked at the structural equations the doctors put in front of him and found the errors before the AI. And his mother held his hand and cried, and the engineers were respectful of this, even though they were also desperate for the answers. The girl from the gymnasium wasn't on the transport. Neither was Brando Volpe, who Matti had never much liked, but whose face had nonetheless gone pale in his mind when the list came up short. He sat with Stella in the observation park. The actual swing set, the real one, the one with the viewport that looked out at the stars. And they didn't talk much. She was going back to training in 2 days. She'd been given a kind of status by the whole business that she wore lightly, as if it didn't belong to her. And she was just holding it for someone. "Do you think they're okay?" she asked. "Androvic thinks so," he said. "He says the Vo'keth don't." He stopped. "They don't hurt them. It's not about that. Not being hurt isn't the same as being okay." "No," he said. "It's not." She pushed her swing back a little, let it carry her forward. "Does your mom say?" "She says they'll keep looking." He paused. "She's been talking to those people from the framework organization. I think she wants to keep working on it. Even after all this is over. Even when it's officially resolved. Is your dad still on the station?" "No." He left. He thought about Androvich for a moment. The pale eyes. The coat that was wrong for the temperature. The 2 hours in the maintenance corridor that had changed everything. He said he'd come back. That there was something he had to do first. "Do you believe him?" He thought about it honestly. "I think so," he said. "I think he mostly tells the truth. He just tells a small amount of it, at a time." She laughed. A small sound. The first time he'd heard her laugh at something that was actually funny, rather than something she was laughing at to manage it. He felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. "The costume thing is kind of funny," she said. It wasn't the costume, I know. But you thought it was. For like 4 minutes. Long 4 minutes. Very long 4 minutes, he agreed. They sat in the observation park, and the stars moved past the viewport in the slow drift of the station's rotation. Somewhere in the conference spaces, diplomats were arguing about what the Vo'keth had done and what it meant and what happened next. And somewhere further out than that, the ships were carrying children in cargo holds towards something they hadn't chosen. And somewhere further still, a woman with a particular kind of power that made his look like a rough draft was alive and looking for him, which was both wonderful and terrifying to know. Right now he was in the park. The stars were doing what stars do. His nose had stopped bleeding 3 weeks ago and hadn't started again since. 6 months later, his mother accepted the position with the framework organization, and they moved to a larger station, a hub, a place where the corridors were wide enough to get lost in. And the market ring ran 2 levels, and there were schools with actual programs, actual things you could learn to do, and nobody, crucially, joyfully, almost tearfully, knew who he was. He wore the second skin suit under his clothes. Not always, not every day, but often enough that it stopped feeling strange. The new school had a physics program run by a teacher named Covarrubias, who was terrifyingly smart and expected the same from her students, and would stop mid-lecture to look at Matti and say, "Silenzi, finish this," and point at the equation on the board. And the first time she did it, he froze, and the second time she did it, he got it wrong, and the third time she did it, he got it right. She nodded and went back to the board. "Better," she said, which from Covarrubias was extravagant. Shh. He started to find other things he was good at. Not things anyone had decided mattered, not yet, not on a schedule anyone else set, but things that accumulated in him quietly the way they had always done. Pattern recognition. Spatial reasoning that Androvich said would develop further as he got older. The ability to be in a place that felt hostile and find, after a while, the geometry of it, where the exits were, where the pressure was unevenly distributed, where the seals were old and where they were new. He stayed in touch with Stella. She was training for a competition circuit that toured the colony stations. Something new, nice, and bright that was being built out of all the old Earth athletics traditions. She sent him messages from different stations with short descriptions and no particular punctuation, which was how she communicated. "Third place finish here, but I landed the full for the first time in competition, so I don't care. The gym here smells like aluminum and someone's bad decisions. How's the new school? Teacher is terrifying," he wrote back. "In a good way, I think. When are you coming visible?" She wrote back, which was not about the power, and he knew it. He thought about it for a while, watching the stars through the viewport in his new quarters. His mother's new uniform was hanging by the door, gray with different insignia, the crest of an organization that was still figuring out what it was. The stars were the same stars. The station rotated at its own rate. "Working on it," he wrote back. That was true. He was working on it. He was 11-year-old, almost 12, in a corridor between things he'd been and things he was going to be. And the power he had was the strangest possible combination of useful and embarrassing. And his father was somewhere in the dark doing something he hadn't fully explained. And his mother was somewhere in a conference room doing something that mattered. And somewhere out there were children who needed finding. He was working on visible. In the meantime, he knew the maintenance corridors of the new station by heart already. He knew which seals were old and which were new. He knew which lights had a half-second lag when they came on, which junctions had echo, which access shafts ran the full length of the station, and which ones terminated in dead ends that weren't on the official maps. He'd been learning how to be invisible his whole life. It turned out that was not a small thing. It was, in fact, exactly the right preparation.